A disgraced Boston socialite, exiled to the brutal New Mexico frontier after refusing a powerful man's assault, must choose between the life that destroyed her and the cowboy who sees her true strength. If you're enjoying this story, please like this video and comment your city below so I can see how far Charlotte's journey has traveled across the world. Now, let's begin. The rain hammered Beacon Hill like divine judgment, turning cobblestones into rivers of filth that swept past the iron gates of the Whitmore estate. Charlotte pressed her forehead against the cold glass of her bedroom window, watching carriages churn through the downpour 3 stories below, their occupants no doubt discussing her ruin with the same relish they'd once reserved for discussing her eligible status. 24 hours ago, she'd been Charlotte Whitmore, daughter of Boston's most prominent shipping magnate. Now she was simply the girl who'd caused a scene at the Vanderbilt ball, the girl who'd slapped Cornelius Bradford, the girl who'd screamed. She could still feel his hands on her waist, her arms, pushing her backward into the darkened library while the orchestra played and champagne flowed and 200 of Boston's finest pretended not to notice a door closing. Could still smell the brandy on his breath when he'd whispered that her father had already agreed to the arrangement, that she should stop playing coy, that nobody would believe her if she made trouble. She'd made trouble anyway. Charlotte closed her eyes against the memory. The weight of him, the sound of her dress tearing, the animal panic that had seized her lungs. She'd fought, clawed, kicked until her heel connected with something soft, and Bradford had stumbled backward with a curse. Then she'd run, bursting back into the ballroom with her hair loose and her sleeve torn and her face streaked with tears. Everyone had seen her. No one had seen him follow her in. The door behind her opened without courtesy of a knock. Charlotte didn't turn. She knew her father's footsteps, heavy and deliberate, the walk of a man accustomed to obedience. "The arrangements are made," Edmund Whitmore said. His voice carried no warmth, no question. "You leave tomorrow morning." "Father, please." Charlotte turned from the window, hating the tremor in her voice. "If you would just listen." "Listen?" His face reddened, jowls shaking with rage, barely contained. "I've listened to nothing but your name being dragged through every drawing room in Boston for an entire day. The Bradfords are one of the most powerful families in New England. Cornelius is a respected businessman, a man of standing. He's a rapist." The word hung between them like smoke. Edmund's hand twitched at his side, and for a moment Charlotte thought he might strike her. Instead, he straightened his waistcoat with a sharp tug. "He is the man I chose for you," Edmund said coldly. "The man who would have elevated this family's position beyond mere merchant wealth. But you couldn't control yourself, could you? Couldn't be graceful, couldn't be silent like a lady should be. He attacked me. You embarrassed him. You embarrassed me." Edmund moved to her wardrobe, throwing open the doors to reveal silks and satins, the armor of her former life. "Half the city watched you have hysterics over nothing more than a private conversation. Bradford was courteous enough not to demand satisfaction, not to pursue legal action for slander. Instead, he's agreed to let the matter rest, provided you disappear." Charlotte's stomach turned to ice. "Disappear?" "The Hawthorns have a cattle operation in New Mexico territory. They need household help, someone educated enough to teach their children when a proper governess can be secured." He pulled a worn carpet bag from the wardrobe's depths, began stuffing her plainest dresses inside. No crinolines, no silk, just cotton and wool, fabric she'd never worn outside of the occasional charity performance. "You'll work there until this scandal fades from memory. 2 years, perhaps 3. "You're sending me away?" Charlotte couldn't breathe. "You're punishing me for being— I'm saving you from complete ruin." Edmund slammed the bag down, breathing hard. "Every door in Boston is closed to you now. Every decent family, every marriage prospect, every opportunity, gone. At least in the territories you can be useful. At least you won't bring further shame upon this house." "And what did you tell people? What story did you spin?" Her father's silence was answer enough. Charlotte felt something crack inside her chest, some last fragile belief in his love. "You told them I was mad," she whispered. "You told them I was unstable. I told them you needed rest, treatment. The frontier air will be beneficial for your disposition." He straightened, adjusting his cufflinks with the same care he'd shown planning her exile. "The train leaves at 8. Be ready." He left without another word, closing the door with quiet finality. Not a slam. That would have suggested emotion. Just a click, like the closing of a ledger. Charlotte stood in the center of her bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of a life that no longer existed. The canopy bed where she'd dreamed of her debut. The vanity where her mother, dead these 10 years, had once taught her to pin her hair. The bookshelf lined with volumes of poetry and philosophy that she'd believed would make her interesting, attractive, worthy. All of it meaningless now. She moved to her desk on wooden legs, pulled out the letter she'd tried to write a dozen times since yesterday. Her hand shook as she dipped the pen in ink. Dearest Margaret, I hope this finds you well. I wanted to explain about the ball, about what truly happened. She stopped. Margaret Ashford had been her closest friend since childhood, but Margaret's mother had already sent word through the housekeeper. The Ashfords would not be receiving Charlotte. Not now. Perhaps not ever. Charlotte crumpled the paper, watching ink bleed across the expensive stationery. They all believed Bradford's version, that she'd encouraged his attention, then turned hysterical when faced with his honorable intentions, that she was unbalanced, fragile, prone to delusions. Why wouldn't they? He was Cornelius Bradford, Harvard-educated, impeccably dressed, heir to a railroad fortune. She was just a girl who'd screamed at the wrong man. The rain intensified, battering the windows like fists demanding entry. Charlotte pulled her thickest shawl around her shoulders and forced herself to pack what her father had left behind. The carpet bag held perhaps a quarter of her wardrobe. No corsets, no evening gowns, nothing that wouldn't survive hard use. She added her mother's pearl hairpins, the only jewelry Edmund hadn't already reclaimed, a volume of Whitman's poetry, small enough to hide. The daguerreotype of her mother she kept in her bedside drawer. At the bottom of her trunk, wrapped in tissue paper, she found the dress she'd worn to the ball. Seafoam green silk, now torn at the shoulder where Bradford's grip had been too strong. There was a stain near the hem, champagne, she thought, or perhaps mud from her flight across the terrace. Evidence. Charlotte stared at it for a long moment, then carefully refolded the tissue paper and tucked it back into the trunk. Let them find it or not. Let them believe her or not. She was done begging for anyone's faith. The train station loomed through the morning fog like a cathedral built for departures. Charlotte sat in the hired carriage alone. Her father had business, apparently more important than seeing his only daughter exiled, watching porters load trunks and families embrace on the platform. A little girl clutched her mother's skirts, crying about leaving her friends. The mother soothed her with promises of adventure, of seeing new places. No one had promised Charlotte anything except disappearance. Miss Whitmore? The driver's voice was carefully neutral. He'd been paid well to ignore questions, to simply deliver his passenger and forget her. We've arrived. Charlotte stepped down onto the platform, carpet bag in hand. The morning air tasted of coal smoke and rain, everything gray and heavy with ending. A porter approached, tipped his cap. Ticket, miss. She fumbled in her reticule for the envelope her father had left on the breakfast table. Inside, a one-way passage to Albuquerque, New Mexico territory, with connections through Chicago and Kansas City. Clipped to the ticket was a bank draft for $20, her entire allowance for the journey and whatever lay beyond. $20 to start a new life. The porter studied her ticket, then gestured toward the third-class carriages at the rear of the train. Not the private compartment she'd always traveled in before, but the public cars where immigrants and laborers crowded onto wooden benches. Charlotte felt heat climb her neck, shame, anger, she couldn't tell anymore. But she lifted her chin and followed him. Charlotte! She turned so fast she nearly dropped her bag. For one wild moment she thought her father had come, had changed his mind. But it was only Thomas, the Whitmore's head groom, hurrying across the platform with a wrapped bundle under his arm. He'd been with the family since Charlotte was born, had taught her to ride, had wiped her tears when her mare went lame. Thomas, you shouldn't be here, she said quickly, glancing around for watching eyes. Associating with her now could cost him his position. Hush. He pressed the bundle into her hands, heavy, solid. Your father doesn't know I'm here, and I'd prefer to keep it that way. But I couldn't let you leave without... Miss Charlotte, your mother was a fine woman. She'd want you to have this. Charlotte unwrapped the cloth to find her mother's traveling Bible, leather-worn soft from use, but it was heavier than she remembered. She opened the cover and caught her breath. Tucked inside the front pages were 5 $20 gold pieces. A fortune. Thomas, I can't. You can, and you will. His weathered face was stern. Your mother saved that, bit by bit, from her own inheritance. She told me once it was for you, for if you ever needed to have choices. He glanced toward the train where steam was already beginning to rise from the engine. I don't know what happened at that ball, Miss Charlotte, but I know you, and I know you wouldn't lie. Her throat closed. She couldn't speak, could barely breathe around the gratitude and grief tangled in her chest. Instead, she threw her arms around him, propriety be damned. Thank you, she whispered. You be careful out there. Thomas patted her shoulder awkwardly, then pulled back. The frontier's not like Boston. You'll need to be strong. I don't feel strong. Strength isn't something you feel, miss. It's something you do. The train whistle screamed, sharp and final. Charlotte gripped the Bible tight and climbed aboard, finding a seat near the window in a car already packed with families, miners, and women who eyed her fine traveling cloak with suspicion. She tucked the gold pieces deeper into the Bible's pages and pressed her forehead to the glass as the train lurched into motion. Beacon Hill slid past, then the Common, then the familiar spires of her childhood fading into smoke and fog. Charlotte watched until there was nothing left to see but wilderness, then closed her eyes against the tears she'd promised herself she wouldn't shed. She didn't see the figure watching from the platform's edge, Cornelius Bradford, immaculate in morning dress, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth as the train carried away the girl who dared to refuse him. The first 2 days passed in a blur of monotony and discomfort. The third-class car had no sleeping berths, just hard benches that left Charlotte's back screaming and her hips bruised. She dozed fitfully, jolting awake whenever the train lurched or stopped, her dreams full of hands grabbing and doors closing and screaming that no one heard. The other passengers gave her a wide berth after the first night, when she'd woken gasping from a nightmare and knocked over someone's dinner pail. She was too fine for them, with her leather bag and quality cloak. But she was alone, unchaperoned, which made her suspicious. Decent women didn't travel unescorted. Decent women didn't end up in third class. Charlotte stopped trying to explain herself. By Chicago, her traveling dress was wrinkled and stained. By Kansas City, she'd traded her cloak to a woman with 3 children for a worn wool blanket and a loaf of bread. The woman had stared at the fine fabric, then at Charlotte. You running from something, girl? Toward something, I hope. The woman had nodded, asked no more questions, and made the trade. The landscape changed as they pushed west. Hills giving way to plains, green fading to brown, trees becoming sparse and twisted. The air grew drier, hotter, tasting of dust and distance. Charlotte watched the endless sky and tried not to think about how far she was from everything she'd ever known. At a water stop in Kansas, she overheard 2 cattlemen discussing New Mexico territory. Whole territory's lawless, one said, spitting tobacco juice onto the platform. Apaches still raiding settlements, Mexican bandits up from Chihuahua. Man's got to be armed just to check his own damn cattle. Heard the Hawthorns lost 2 hands last month, the other replied. Caught in a flash flood in one of them arroyos. Found the bodies 3 miles downstream. Charlotte's stomach turned. She'd imagined exile to be lonely, perhaps uncomfortable, but dangerous? The letter from the Hawthorns had mentioned nothing about raids or floods or bodies. Of course it hadn't. Who would agree to come if they knew? She pulled her mother's Bible from her bag, running her fingers over the worn leather. The gold pieces were still there, hidden against the spine. Enough to buy passage somewhere else, perhaps. Enough to start over in a city where no one knew her name. But where? Boston was closed to her. New York would be no better. The Bradfords had family there, influence. Philadelphia, Baltimore. Anywhere within the social sphere of her old life would eventually connect her to her father's shipping empire and the scandal that had driven her out. No. The only direction left was forward, into the unknown. Charlotte tucked the Bible away and watched the planes scroll past, mile after empty mile. Albuquerque was nothing like Boston. The town sprawled low and brown against the desert landscape, adobe buildings baking under a sun so bright it made Charlotte's eyes water. The air smelled of dust and horses and something else, chili peppers roasting maybe, or mesquite smoke. People moved slowly, conserving energy in the heat, their faces weathered and hard. Charlotte stepped off the train onto a platform that was more packed dirt than proper station, her carpet bag heavy in her hand. The other passengers dispersed quickly, met by family or business associates, or simply walking away with the confidence of people who knew where they belonged. She stood alone, searching the small crowd for someone who might be looking for her. The Hawthorns had sent word they'd send a man to collect her, but the platform was clearing fast and no one approached. "You lost, miss?" Charlotte turned to find a rail-thin man in a dusty suit watching her with narrowed eyes. He looked like an undertaker, all sharp angles and knowing assessment. "I'm waiting for someone," she said, keeping her voice steady. "From the Hawthorne Ranch." The man's eyebrows rose. "You're the girl they sent for? The Boston lady?" Heat crawled up Charlotte's neck. "I'm Miss Whitmore, yes." "Huh." He looked her up and down with undisguised skepticism. "Well, you're a day early. Wire must have got mixed up. Hawthorns won't send anyone until tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Charlotte's grip tightened on her bag. "But I've nowhere to—" "There's a boarding house 2 blocks that way." He pointed down a dusty street lined with low buildings. "Mrs. Chen runs it. Clean enough if you don't mind sharing a room. $3 a night." $3. Nearly a sixth of her remaining money. Charlotte forced herself to nod. "Thank you." She walked the direction he'd indicated, acutely aware of the stares following her. A woman alone, clearly not from here, with no man to escort or protect her. In Boston, such a situation would be scandalous. Here, it seemed merely foolish. The boarding house was a squat adobe structure with a hand-painted sign that read Chen's Lodging, clean beds, no trouble. Charlotte pushed through the door into a dim common room that smelled of lye soap and coffee. "Help you?" A tiny Chinese woman emerged from a back room, wiping her hands on an apron. Her eyes were sharp, taking in Charlotte's travel-stained dress and expensive bag with a single glance. "I need a room for the night," Charlotte said. "Possibly 2 nights. I'm waiting for transport to the Hawthorne Ranch." Mrs. Chen's expression shifted slightly. "Hawthorne Place is 3 days' ride north, hard country." "So I'm learning." $3, paid now. Supper's extra." "You got money?" Charlotte pulled out her father's bank draft, but Mrs. Chen shook her head. "No paper. Coin only." "Of course." Charlotte's fingers trembled as she extracted one of her mother's gold pieces from the Bible. Mrs. Chen's eyes widened fractionally, but she made no comment, just fetched change from a locked box, and led Charlotte upstairs to a narrow room containing 2 beds and a washstand. "Supper's at 6, Mrs. Chen said. "You lock your door at night. This is a decent house, but decent doesn't mean safe." She left Charlotte alone in the sparse room. Charlotte sank onto the nearest bed, every muscle in her body aching from 6 days of travel, and stared at the whitewashed wall. Somewhere in this building, people were talking, laughing, living lives that had nothing to do with disgrace or exile. Charlotte lay back and closed her eyes, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this strange place. Somewhere a door slammed. Somewhere a woman sang in Spanish, her voice high and clear. Somewhere horses whinnied and men shouted and the world kept turning, indifferent to the fact that Charlotte Whitmore's life had ended. Or perhaps it had just begun. She wouldn't know until tomorrow. The man who came for her wasn't what Charlotte expected. She'd imagined someone older, perhaps, someone who looked like the ranch hand she'd seen occasionally in Boston, weathered but harmless, respectful in that careful way servants had around their betters. Instead, the man leaning against the boarding house porch rail was maybe 30, wearing clothes so covered in dust they might have been any color originally, and watching her with an expression that suggested he'd already decided she wouldn't last a week. "You Charlotte Whitmore?" His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. "I am." Charlotte straightened her spine, refusing to be intimidated. "And you are?" "Rhett Calder. I work for the Hawthorns." He didn't offer his hand, just pushed off the rail and gestured toward a wagon loaded with supplies. "We got a 3-day ride. You bring more than that bag?" "No?" "Good. Means you might actually get there with your things." He started toward the wagon, clearly expecting her to follow. "You know how to ride?" Yes, but wagon's full. You'll take the spare mare." He glanced back at her dress, dusty but still recognizable as city-made. "Hope you got something more practical than that. You'll cook in velvet out here." Charlotte's temper flared. She'd spent a week being judged, dismissed, treated like a problem to be managed. This rough cowboy wouldn't be another in that line. "Mr. Calder, I understand you've been inconvenienced by having to collect me. but I'd appreciate being spoken to with a modicum of respect. He stopped walking, turned. For the first time, she saw something other than dismissal in his face. Maybe surprise, maybe amusement. His eyes were gray, she noticed, pale against sun-dark skin. Respect, he repeated like the word was foreign. Ma'am, out here, respect is earned, not demanded. You want me to treat you gentle, you'll need to prove you're tougher than you look. I'm tougher than I look. We'll see. But something in his expression had shifted, just slightly. You eat breakfast? No. Market's that way. Get something you can eat in the saddle, jerky, hard bread, nothing fancy. We leave in an hour. He paused. And Miss Whitmore? Whatever trouble you left behind in Boston, leave it there. We got enough to deal with without city problems. He walked away before she could respond, leaving Charlotte standing in the street with her bag and her anger and the creeping suspicion that nothing she'd learned in 20 years of Boston society would matter here. An hour later, she was on horseback for the first time in months, following Rhett Calder north into country so vast and empty it made her chest tight with something between terror and awe. The frontier swallowed them whole, and Charlotte realized with cold certainty that she was more alone now than she'd ever been. Behind them, Albuquerque faded into heat shimmer and dust. Ahead, the mountains waited like broken teeth against an endless sky. And Charlotte Whitmore, who'd once believed her biggest challenge would be choosing between suitors at a ball, gripped the reins with blistered hands and rode toward whatever came next. The first blister opened on Charlotte's palm 3 hours into the ride. She felt it pop, warm fluid spreading beneath the leather reins, but didn't say anything. Rhett Calder rode 20 feet ahead, his back straight and his attention fixed on the horizon like she didn't exist. He hadn't spoken since they'd left Albuquerque except to grunt directions. Bear left at that rock. Water the horses here. And Charlotte had decided she'd rather bleed than ask him to slow down. The sun climbed higher, turning the air into something solid and punishing. Sweat soaked through Charlotte's collar, her corset, pooling in places she'd never sweated before. Her mare, a patient bay with kind eyes, plodded forward without complaint, but Charlotte could feel her own body beginning to fail. Her thighs screamed where they gripped the saddle. Her lower back had gone from aching to numb. The base of her skull throbbed with each hoofbeat. We'll stop when we reach the canyon, Rhett called back without turning. Charlotte squinted ahead at the landscape, seeing nothing but more dust and scrub brush and distant mountains that never seemed to get closer. How far? 2 hours, maybe 3. 3 more hours. Charlotte bit the inside of her cheek and tasted blood. She'd ridden in Boston, of course. Sedate canters through manicured parks, side saddle on horses trained to behave like rocking chairs. This was different. This was brutal endurance, and her body wasn't built for it. But neither was she going to quit. The blister on her right hand had a twin by the time Rhett finally pulled up beside a dry creek bed, cutting through rust-colored rock. Charlotte dismounted and her legs nearly buckled. She caught herself on the stirrup, breathing hard. You good? Rhett was already loosening his horse's girth, not looking at her. Fine. You're limping. I said I'm fine. He shrugged and led his gelding toward a trickle of water pooling between stones. Charlotte forced herself to follow, even though each step sent lightning up her spine. The mare drank gratefully. Charlotte knelt beside her and cupped water in her raw palms, hissing at the sting. Let me see. She jerked back, but Rhett had already dropped to a crouch beside her. He grabbed her wrist, not roughly, but firmly enough that she couldn't pull away without making it a fight, and turned her hand palm up. The blisters had torn completely open, leaving raw flesh exposed. Why didn't you say something? His voice was flat, unreadable. Would it have mattered? He released her wrist and stood, digging through his saddlebag. You let these get infected out here. You could lose the hand. Then you're useless to the Hawthorns, and I've wasted 3 days hauling you north for nothing. How reassuring to know my value. Rhett returned with a small tin of salve and a strip of cotton cloth. He grabbed her hand again, gentler this time, and began coating the wounds with something that smelled like pine tar and burned like hellfire. Charlotte sucked in a breath but didn't pull away. You ride much back in Boston? He asked, wrapping the cloth around her palm with quick efficiency. Some. Side saddle, I'm guessing. Yes. That explains the bleeding. He tied off the bandage and reached for her other hand. You're gripping too tight. trying to stay on the same way you would in a park. Out here you need to move with the horse, let your hips follow her rhythm. Otherwise you'll tear yourself apart. Charlotte watched him work, surprised by the carefulness of his movements. His hands were scarred and calloused, nails broken short, but they wrapped her wounds with the precision of someone who'd done this before. For himself, probably. Maybe for others. "Why do you care if I tear myself apart?" she asked. Rhett glanced up at her, those pale gray eyes unreadable. "Don't. But Mrs. Hawthorne will have my hide if I deliver you unable to work, and I'm fond of my hide." He released her hand and stood, already moving back toward the horses. Charlotte flexed her fingers, testing the bandages. They were tight enough to protect, but loose enough to move. Professional work. "Thank you," she called after him. He didn't acknowledge it, just pulled jerky from his saddlebag and tossed a piece in her direction. "Eat. We're not stopping again until dark." They rode until the sun balanced on the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of copper and blood. Charlotte's body had moved past pain into a kind of hollow exhaustion where nothing felt real anymore. She swayed in the saddle, half asleep, trusting the mare to follow Rhett's gelding. "We'll camp here," Rhett announced, pulling up beside a cluster of juniper trees that offered the first real shade they'd seen in hours. Charlotte slid from the saddle and her legs gave out completely. She hit the ground hard, tasting dust, too tired to be embarrassed. "Easy." Rhett appeared beside her, offering his hand. "First day's always the worst." She let him pull her up, hating that she needed the help. "How much farther?" "2 more days like this one." He must have seen something in her face because he added, "You made it through today. That's more than some city folk manage." It wasn't exactly encouragement, but Charlotte clung to it anyway. While Rhett unsaddled the horses and built a fire, Charlotte collapsed against her carpet bag and watched the stars emerge. She'd never seen so many. No city lights to drown them out, just millions of pinpricks blazing against black velvet. The sight was so overwhelming it made her chest ache. "You religious?" Rhett asked suddenly. Charlotte glanced at him across the fire. He was cooking something in a small pan, beans maybe, or some kind of dried meat stew. "Why do you ask?" "Most Boston ladies are. Figured you might want to pray or something before eating." "No." The word came out harder than she'd intended. "I'm not." He nodded, stirring the pan. "Good. Out here you learn pretty quick that praying doesn't do much. Working does." They ate in silence, Charlotte forcing down the unfamiliar food because she knew she needed the strength. It tasted like salt and smoke, and nothing like the delicate meals she'd grown up with, but her stomach didn't care. She was hungry enough to eat anything. "Can I ask you something?" Charlotte said after a while. Rhett poked at the fire with a stick. "Can't stop you." "Why did the Hawthorns ask for someone from Boston? Surely there are women closer who need work." "Mrs. Hawthorne's particular about education. Wants someone who can teach her kids proper reading, writing, numbers, all that. Most folks out here didn't get much schooling." He glanced at her. "You did, I'm guessing." "Private tutors until I was 16, then finishing school." "Finishing school." He said it like it was a foreign concept. "What'd they teach you there?" "French, needlepoint, how to pour tea without making noise, how to enter a room so men would notice." Charlotte heard the bitterness in her own voice and didn't try to hide it. "Useful skills for a cattle ranch, I'm sure." "The needlepoint might come in handy. Everything out here needs mending." Rhett set down his plate and leaned back against his saddle. "But if you're expecting the Hawthorne place to be like some kind of finishing school, you should know now it's not. It's a working ranch. Everyone pulls their weight or they don't eat." "I'm not afraid of work." "We'll see." There was that phrase again. Charlotte wrapped her arms around her knees, feeling every muscle protest. "You don't think I'll last?" "Didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Rhett was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "I've seen plenty of city people come west thinking it'll be an adventure. Most don't make it a month. This place breaks people who aren't ready for it." He looked at her directly. "I don't know you well enough to say if you're ready, but I know you've got blisters on top of blisters, and you didn't complain once today, and that's something." It was the closest thing to respect he'd offered. Charlotte felt an unexpected warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "I won't break," she said quietly. "Then I hope you're right." They settled into their bedrolls as the fire burned down to embers. Charlotte lay on her back, staring up at the impossible stars, listening to the night sounds of the desert, crickets chirping, wind moving through the junipers, something howling in the far distance that made her skin prickle. "Mr. Calder," she whispered, "was that a wolf?" "Coyote. They won't bother us. And if they do, then I'll shoot them." A pause. "Go to sleep, Miss Whitmore. Tomorrow's going to be harder than today." Charlotte closed her eyes and tried not to think about how that was possible. The second day was exactly as hard as Rhett had promised. Charlotte's muscles had stiffened overnight into knots of pure agony. Mounting the mare required 3 attempts and a humiliating boost from Rhett, who said nothing but whose silence felt loaded with judgment. They rode through country that grew progressively rougher, rocky arroyos that made the horses pick their way carefully, stretches of deep sand that slowed them to a crawl, hills covered in vegetation that scratched and grabbed. The sun was relentless. Charlotte's lips cracked and bled. Her eyes stung from squinting against the glare. Around midday, Rhett pulled up suddenly, his hand raised in a signal Charlotte didn't understand. She stopped her mare, heart hammering. "What is it?" "Quiet." He was staring at something in the distance. Charlotte followed his gaze and saw riders, 3 of them, maybe 4, too far away to make out details. They were moving parallel to Rhett and Charlotte's path, not approaching, but not leaving either. "Apaches?" Charlotte whispered, remembering the cattleman's conversation at the train station. "Don't know yet." Rhett's hand drifted toward the rifle strapped to his saddle. Could be ranchers, could be bandits, could be nothing. They watched the riders for several long minutes. Charlotte became acutely aware of how exposed they were, just 2 people in the middle of endless nothing. If those riders decided to cause trouble, there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run that the horses couldn't follow. Then the distant riders turned north and disappeared behind a ridge. Rhett relaxed fractionally. Probably just passing through. But we'll take the long route anyway, stay clear of the trails. Does this happen often? Often enough. He kicked his gelding into motion. Territory's not exactly settled law out here. You learn to be cautious. They rode until well past dark, not stopping until Rhett found a sheltered spot behind a rock formation that would hide their fire from distant eyes. Charlotte dismounted and stood shaking, too exhausted to help with the horses or the camp. Rhett didn't comment, just worked in silence until everything was secure. "Eat this." He pressed hardtack into her hand. "Then sleep. We'll reach the ranch by tomorrow night if we push hard." Charlotte gnawed the hardtack. It was like eating leather, and watched Rhett move around the camp with easy efficiency. He'd grown up doing this, she realized. This brutal landscape was his normal. "How long have you worked for the Hawthorns?" she asked. 6 years, give or take. "And before that?" "Drifted. Worked ranches from Texas to Montana." He glanced at her. "You always ask this many questions?" "I'm curious about the place I'm going to live." "Fair enough." Rhett settled by the fire, rolling a cigarette with practiced fingers. "The Hawthorns are decent people. Work you hard, but treat you fair. Mrs. Hawthorne runs a tight household. She'll expect you to earn your keep same as everyone else. But she's not cruel." "What about Mr. Hawthorne?" "Good rancher. Smart about cattle, water, when to move the herds. Doesn't talk much." He lit the cigarette, exhaled smoke. "They've got 2 kids. Samuel's 8, Emma's 5. Good children, mostly. Samuel's got his mother's temper. Emma's shy." Charlotte absorbed this, trying to picture the family that would be her new life. "And the other hands? What are they like?" "There's about a dozen of us total. Some are all right, some are rough. Most will ignore you as long as you stay out of their way." Rhett's expression shifted slightly. "But, Miss Whitmore, I'm going to be straight with you. You're going to be the only unmarried woman on that ranch besides Mrs. Hawthorne. That means you need to be careful. Don't go wandering alone. Don't encourage attention. Don't put yourself in situations where a man might get ideas." Heat climbed Charlotte's neck. Anger and shame tangled together. "I know how to conduct myself." "I'm sure you do. But out here the rules are different. A man might see a woman alone and think she's available, whether she is or not. Just..." He looked uncomfortable. "Just be smart." Charlotte thought of Bradford's hands, his breath, the library door closing. "I'm always smart," she said bitterly. Doesn't seem to matter. Rhett studied her for a long moment. Something happened to you back in Boston. It wasn't a question. Charlotte's throat tightened. That why you left? He pressed. I didn't leave. I was sent. Against your will, Charlotte laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. Does it matter? I'm here either way. It matters. Rhett's voice was quiet but certain. A person running toward something moves different than a person running away. I'm not running at all. I'm exiled. Then I hope you find something worth staying for. Charlotte looked at him across the fire, this strange, rough man who'd bandaged her hands and warned her about wolves, and now talked about hope like he actually believed in it. She wanted to ask what he'd found worth staying for, but exhaustion dragged at her bones and her eyes kept closing. Get some sleep, Rhett said, already turning away. Tomorrow, you'll meet your new life. The third day dawned cold and clear. Charlotte woke stiff and sore, her whole body one massive bruise, but she forced herself up and onto the mare without asking for help. Rhett noticed, she saw it in the slight nod he gave her, but said nothing. They rode through country that gradually shifted from desert to something greener. Grass appeared in patches, then in waves. Trees grew taller. The air smelled different, less dust and more earth. Mountains rose ahead of them, not the distant jagged peaks they'd been riding toward, but closer ranges thick with pine. That's Hawthorne land, Rhett said, pointing to a fence line running along a ridge. Another hour, and we'll be there. Charlotte's stomach knotted with nerves. For 3 days she'd been focused entirely on survival. Staying on the horse, not complaining, making it through. Now she had to think about what came next. Meeting the Hawthorns, starting work, becoming whoever she needed to be to survive here. They crested a hill, and Charlotte saw the ranch spread out below. It was nothing like she'd imagined. The main house was low and sprawling, built from logs and stone, with a wide porch wrapping 3 sides. Outbuildings scattered across the property, barns, bunkhouses, storage sheds, a structure that might be a smokehouse. Cattle dotted the pastures, hundreds of them, red and brown against green grass. Horses grazed in corrals. Chickens pecked in the yard. It looked established, permanent, real. It's bigger than I expected, Charlotte said. One of the largest operations in the territory. The Hawthorns run about 3,000 head. Rhett urged his gelding forward. Come on, Mrs. Hawthorne will want to meet you before supper. They rode down the hill and into the ranch yard. Several men stopped work to watch them pass. Ranch hands, Charlotte assumed, their faces weathered and curious. She kept her eyes forward, back straight, trying to look more confident than she felt. Rhett pulled up at the main house and dismounted. Charlotte followed suit, her legs trembling. Before she could steady herself, the front door opened and a woman emerged. Mrs. Hawthorne was perhaps 40, sturdy and sun-browned, wearing a practical calico dress and an apron stained with what looked like berry juice. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her eyes were sharp as she took in Charlotte's travel-stained appearance. You're the Boston girl. Charlotte Whitmore, ma'am. Charlotte dipped a small curtsy, then immediately felt foolish. This wasn't a drawing room, but Mrs. Hawthorne's expression softened slightly. Well, at least you've got manners. Rhett, she give you any trouble? No, ma'am. Kept up the whole way. Good. Mrs. Hawthorne descended the porch steps and circled Charlotte slowly, assessing. You're thinner than I expected, and younger. How old are you, girl? 20, ma'am? 20 and sent west alone. That's unusual. Her eyes narrowed. Your father's letter said you needed a fresh start. What kind of trouble are you running from? Charlotte's chest tightened. She'd practiced this answer during the long train ride, rehearsed it in her head until it sounded almost true. No trouble, ma'am. My father thought the frontier air would be beneficial for my health. Your health? Mrs. Hawthorne didn't sound convinced. You sick? No, ma'am. Pregnant? No. Had to ask. Last girl we hired turned out to be running from a husband. Caused all kinds of problems when he showed up. Mrs. Hawthorne sighed. All right, Miss Whitmore. I'm going to be straight with you. I need someone to help with the children's education and the household work. Cooking, cleaning, mending, gardening. Whatever needs doing. In exchange, you get room and board and $2 a month. You attend church on Sundays, you keep yourself decent, and you don't cause drama with my men. Those terms acceptable? $2 a month. Charlotte tried not to let her shock show. In Boston, she'd spent more than that on a single pair of gloves. But out here, with nowhere else to go and no other options, it might as well have been a fortune. Yes, ma'am. Very acceptable. Good. Rhett, take her horse to the barn. Miss Whitmore, follow me. We'll get you settled, then you can start on supper. Mrs. Hawthorne turned and headed back inside. Charlotte grabbed her carpet bag and hurried after her, leaving Rhett standing in the yard. She glanced back once and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Then the door closed and Charlotte was inside, following Mrs. Hawthorne through a house that smelled of wood smoke and coffee and something baking. The main room was large and practical, rough furniture, braided rugs, shelves lined with preserves and books. No delicate ornaments or decorative flourishes. Everything here served a purpose. Children's room is there, our room's there, and you'll be here. Mrs. Hawthorne opened a door off the kitchen to reveal a tiny space barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand. It's not much, but it's private. You'll share the washroom with the family. Charlotte set her bag on the bed. The room was smaller than her closet in Boston, the bed hard and simple. But there was a window that looked out toward the mountains, and the quilt covering the mattress was hand-stitched and clean. It's perfect, she said, and meant it. Mrs. Hawthorne's expression shifted. Not quite approval, but close. Get yourself washed up and changed if you've got something clean. Then come to the kitchen. I'll show you where things are, and you can help with the bread. She left, her footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. Charlotte closed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. 3 days of riding, 6 days of travel, weeks of disgrace and exile had led to this tiny room in the middle of nowhere. She should have felt despair. Instead, she felt something unexpected. Relief. No one here knew about Bradford or the ball or her father's betrayal. No one here cared about Boston society or her ruined reputation. Here, she was just Charlotte Whitmore, and she could be anyone she chose to be. Charlotte unpacked quickly, changing into her least wrinkled dress and pinning her hair into something presentable. Her hands still ached from the blisters, but Rhett's bandages had held. She studied herself in the small mirror above the washstand and barely recognized the woman staring back. Sun-flushed, freckled, her eyes somehow harder than they'd been a week ago. All right, she whispered to her reflection. You survived Boston. You survived the journey. Now survive this. The kitchen was warm and busy when Charlotte entered. Mrs. Hawthorne stood at a massive stove, stirring something in a pot large enough to bathe in. 2 children sat at the table, a boy with dark hair and suspicious eyes, a little girl who watched Charlotte with open curiosity. Children, this is Miss Whitmore. She'll be helping me around the house and teaching you your lessons. Mrs. Hawthorne didn't look up from her stirring. Miss Whitmore, that's Samuel and Emma. They're mostly civilized. Mostly, Samuel muttered. Charlotte smiled despite herself. Hello, Samuel. Emma. Emma waved shyly. Samuel just stared. Miss Whitmore, you know how to make biscuits? Mrs. Hawthorne asked. I've watched it done. Watching's not the same as doing, but we'll start there. Flour's in that bin, lard's in the crock, buttermilk's in the cooling box. Mix until it feels right, then cut them out and get them in the oven before the stew's done. Charlotte approached the supplies with the same trepidation she might approach a wild animal. She'd never actually cooked anything in her life. In Boston, that was what the kitchen staff did. But she'd watched enough to understand the basic principle. Flour, lard, liquid, mix, bake. She plunged her hands into the flour and began. The first batch came out hard as rocks. Mrs. Hawthorne took one, tapped it against the table, and raised an eyebrow. Well, they'd make good projectiles. Try again, less mixing this time. The second batch was better, not good, but edible. Mrs. Hawthorne actually nodded. You'll learn. Most things out here are like that. You fail until you don't. They worked side by side, preparing supper for a household of 15, the family plus the dozen ranch hands who ate at a long table in what Mrs. Hawthorne called the dining hall. Charlotte chopped vegetables until her wrists ached, stirred pots that made her arms burn, learned to time everything so it finished together. It was hot, exhausting work, and by the time the meal was ready, Charlotte was drenched in sweat. "You'll serve the men," Mrs. Hawthorne instructed. "Move quick. Don't chat. Don't linger. They're good workers, but they're still men. Understand?" Charlotte understood. She'd spent her whole life navigating men's attention, though in Boston it had looked different. Here it was raw, direct, undisguised by the polish of money and breeding. She carried platters of food to the dining hall, where the ranch hands had already gathered. They fell silent as she entered, 12 pairs of eyes tracking her movement. Charlotte kept her face neutral, set down the food, and retreated without meeting anyone's gaze. "That's the new girl?" someone said behind her. "Prettier than the last one. Wonder how long she'll last." Charlotte's jaw tightened, but she kept walking. Back in the kitchen, Mrs. Hawthorne was already preparing the family's plates. "You did fine," the older woman said. "They'll test you for a few days, see if they can get a reaction. Don't give them one." They ate together at the kitchen table, Charlotte, Mrs. Hawthorne, the children, and Mr. Hawthorne, who turned out to be a silent, weathered man who nodded at Charlotte but didn't speak. The food was simple but filling, so different from the elaborate meals she'd grown up with that it felt like eating in a foreign country. After supper came dishes, then preparing food for the next day, then mending by lamplight while Mrs. Hawthorne gave instructions about the household routine. Charlotte would wake at 5, help with breakfast, clean the house, work in the garden, help with lunch, teach the children for 2 hours, help with supper, then mend or preserve or whatever else needed doing until bedtime. "Sundays we rest," Mrs. Hawthorne said, threading a needle with practiced ease. "Mostly. Still got to feed everyone, but the heavy work waits." Charlotte nodded, too tired to speak. Every part of her body hurt. Her hands were raw despite the bandages. Her feet throbbed from standing all day. But she'd made it through. Day 1 at the ranch, survived. "You can go to bed," Mrs. Hawthorne said finally. "You look like you're about to fall over." Charlotte stumbled to her tiny room and collapsed onto the bed without bothering to change. Through the thin walls, she could hear the family settling for the night. Mr. Hawthorne's low voice, Emma giggling at something, Samuel arguing about bedtime. Outside, the ranch was quieting too. Horses whickering in the barns. Men's voices fading as they headed to the bunkhouse. And beneath it all, the endless whisper of wind moving through grass and pine. Charlotte closed her eyes and let exhaustion pull her under, too tired even to dream about the life she'd left behind. Charlotte woke to darkness and the sound of roosters screaming their triumph at a dawn that hadn't arrived yet. Her body refused to move at first, every muscle locked in protest. She forced herself upright anyway, fumbling for the lamp on the washstand. Her hands shook as she lit it, the blisters from the ride now joined by burns from yesterday's cooking and new calluses forming where she'd gripped the knife-chopping vegetables for hours. The house was already stirring. She could hear Mrs. Hawthorne moving in the kitchen, the clank of pots and the hiss of the stove being stoked. Charlotte dressed quickly in the dim light, pinning her hair with clumsy fingers. The mirror showed her a stranger again, face thinner after just days of hard work, freckles multiplying across her nose despite her best efforts to stay shaded. In Boston, freckles had been a mark of lower class. Here, everyone had them. "You're late," Mrs. Hawthorne said when Charlotte appeared in the kitchen. It was still pitch black outside. "Breakfast starts at 5:30. Men work from sunup to sundown. They need food before they start. I'm sorry, Don't apologize, just move faster. Start the coffee. 10 cups of grounds in that pot. Fill it to the line with water from the pump." Charlotte grabbed the massive coffee pot and hurried outside to the pump. The morning air bit through her thin dress, cold enough to see her breath. She worked the pump handle, muscles screaming until water gushed into the pot. 10 cups of ground seemed like enough to fuel an army, but she measured it out and hauled everything back inside. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of motion. Biscuits, better than yesterday, but still dense. Eggs scrambled in batches. Bacon fried until the whole house reeked of smoke and grease. Gravy made from the bacon fat that Mrs. Hawthorne insisted had to be stirred constantly or it would burn. Charlotte stirred until her wrist cramped, then switched hands and kept going. When the men filed into the dining hall, Charlotte served them with the same neutral efficiency as the night before. Some nodded their thanks. Most ignored her. One, a kid who couldn't be older than 17, tried to catch her eye and smile. Charlotte looked straight through him and kept moving. "Smart girl," Mrs. Hawthorne muttered when Charlotte returned to the kitchen. That's Tommy. He's harmless but eager. Don't encourage him. They ate their own breakfast standing up, too busy preparing the next meal to sit. Charlotte forced down biscuits that tasted like sawdust and coffee, strong enough to strip paint. Her stomach had stopped expecting flavor days ago. Now it just wanted fuel. After breakfast came cleaning. Charlotte scrubbed dishes until her hands were raw, then moved to sweeping floors, beating rugs, wiping down every surface in the main house. The work was endless and monotonous, but there was something almost meditative about it. Her mind could drift while her body moved through familiar motions. She thought about Boston sometimes, about her bedroom with its soft bed and pretty things, about Margaret Ashford and the other girls she'd considered friends, about her father, who'd chosen his reputation over his daughter without hesitation. Mostly, she tried not to think at all. Miss Whitmore. Emma appeared in the doorway, clutching a rag doll with one eye missing. Mama says it's lesson time. Charlotte set down her scrub brush and followed the little girl to the main room, where Samuel was already slouched at the table looking mutinous. Mrs. Hawthorne had left out slates and chalk, a few battered books, and a note in firm handwriting. Reading, writing, arithmetic. 2 hours. Make them work. Charlotte sat across from the children and tried to remember what her tutors had done. All right. Samuel, what's the last book you read? Don't read books. You can't read? Didn't say that. Said I don't read books. He crossed his arms. Books are boring. What about you, Emma? The little girl shook her head shyly. Charlotte looked between them, these two children growing up in the middle of nowhere with limited access to education or culture or anything beyond the ranch. In Boston, 8-year-olds were studying Latin and geography. Here, Samuel couldn't be bothered with books. What if I told you a story instead? Charlotte asked. And then you could write about it after. Samuel's expression shifted slightly. What kind of story? Whatever kind you want. Cowboys and outlaws, he said immediately. Horses, Emma whispered. Charlotte smiled. I can work with that. She told them a story she made up on the spot. A girl who found a wild Mustang in the mountains and trained it herself, then used the horse to track down the outlaws who'd stolen her family's cattle. It wasn't sophisticated literature, but Samuel leaned forward listening, and Emma's eyes went wide with excitement. Now, Charlotte said when she finished, Samuel, you write down 3 things that happened in the story. Emma, you draw me a picture of the horse. That's not a real lesson, Samuel protested. You're writing, aren't you? That's more than you were doing 5 minutes ago. He scowled, but picked up the chalk. Emma was already drawing, her tongue poking out in concentration. Charlotte watched them work and felt something unexpected, satisfaction. Not the performance satisfaction of executing a perfect curtsy or playing a difficult piece on the piano. Something deeper, earned. They worked through reading and basic arithmetic, Charlotte adjusting her approach constantly as she figured out what held their attention and what made them shut down. Samuel was quick with numbers but hated sitting still. Emma could barely write but remembered everything she heard. By the time 2 hours had passed, Charlotte's voice was hoarse and her head ached, but both children had actually learned something. Did you do your lessons, Mrs.? Hawthorne asked when Charlotte returned to the kitchen. We did. They give you trouble? Samuel tried, but I handled it. Mrs. Hawthorne's mouth quirked in what might have been approval. Good. Most teachers we've had quit after a week because they couldn't control him. You might actually work out. Charlotte helped prepare lunch, more of the same endless cooking and serving, then was sent to the garden to harvest vegetables. The garden sprawled behind the house, neat rows of beans and squash and tomatoes bordered by herbs Charlotte couldn't name. She knelt in the dirt and began picking, her back aching within minutes. You're doing it wrong. Charlotte looked up to find Rhett standing at the garden's edge, hat pushed back, watching her with that same measuring expression he always wore. I'm picking vegetables, she said. How can that be wrong? You're bruising them. Tomatoes need a gentle touch. He crouched beside her and demonstrated, his scarred hands cradling a tomato like it might break. Support it from underneath, twist easy. Don't pull. Charlotte tried again, this time managing to harvest one without crushing it. Better? Better? He rocked back on his heels. How's your first week treating you? It's only been 2 days. Feels longer, doesn't it? Charlotte laughed despite herself. Everything here takes longer. I've never been so tired in my life. You're keeping up, though. Mrs. Hawthorne mentioned you got the kids to actually work. You and Mrs. Hawthorne talk about me? Small ranch. People talk. Rhett picked a tomato and examined it critically. For what it's worth, the hands were placing bets on how long you'd last. Most figured 3 days. And you? I don't bet on things I can't predict. He set the tomato in her basket. You're harder to figure than most. Charlotte wasn't sure if that was a compliment or criticism. What do you mean? City ladies usually fall into 2 types, the ones who try to make everything like it was back home and fail, or the ones who give up immediate and wait for rescue. You're doing neither. He studied her face. You're actually trying. What else would I do? Most would find a way to leave, get married to some rancher, go back east, something. But you're here, in the dirt, learning tomatoes. He stood, brushing soil from his knees. That's different. He walked away before Charlotte could respond, leaving her alone with the vegetables and a strange warmth in her chest. Rhett Calder noticed things. He paid attention in a way that felt different from being watched. Less judgment, more curiosity. Charlotte returned to picking tomatoes with gentle hands. The days began to blur together into a rhythm that was brutal but predictable. Wake before dawn. Cook, clean, teach, cook, clean, collapse into bed. Charlotte's body adapted slowly, building calluses and strength, where before there'd been only softness. Her hands stopped bleeding. Her back stopped screaming. She learned to move through the work without thinking, letting muscle memory carry her. She learned other things, too. How to tell when bread dough had been kneaded enough by the way it felt under her palms. Which chickens were laying and which were just pretending. How to carry water without sloshing. How to sharpen knives on the whetstone without cutting herself. Small, practical skills that would have been useless in Boston, but here meant the difference between competence and failure. The men slowly stopped treating her like a curiosity and started treating her like furniture. There, but unremarkable. Tommy still smiled too much, but even he backed off after Mrs. Hawthorne had a word with him. Charlotte moved through the dining hall invisible, which was exactly what she wanted. Except Rhett still watched her sometimes. She'd catch him looking during meals or when she was crossing the yard with laundry. Not the hungry way some of the other men looked. More like he was trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. On Sunday, the household slept an extra hour, a luxury that felt almost sinful. Charlotte woke to full daylight streaming through her window and lay there for a moment just breathing, marveling at the absence of roosters and urgency. Miss Whitmore? Emma's voice came through the door. Mama says we're going to town for church. Do you want to come? Town. Charlotte hadn't left the ranch since arriving, too exhausted at the end of each day to think about anywhere else. The idea of seeing other people, other places, felt both appealing and terrifying. Give me 10 minutes, she called back. She dressed in her best remaining dress, dark blue cotton that had survived the journey relatively unscathed, and pinned her hair into something presentable. The woman in the mirror looked different now. Sunbrown, thinner, harder. Her hands were rough and scarred. Her face had lost its Boston pallor. She looked like she belonged here, and Charlotte wasn't sure how to feel about that. The wagon ride to town took an hour, the family packed together on hard benches. Samuel complained about his collar. Emma sang quietly to herself. Mr. Hawthorne drove in silence while Mrs. Hawthorne pointed out landmarks and neighbors' ranches. That's the Morrison place. They run sheep, if you can imagine anything so foolish in cattle country. And that's where the Peterson boy got kicked by his horse last spring, nearly died before the doctor got there. Charlotte listened and filed away information, building a mental map of this new world. The town was barely bigger than Albuquerque. A main street lined with wooden buildings, a church with a white steeple, people gathering in their Sunday clothes. The Hawthornes were greeted warmly, clearly well known and respected. Charlotte hung back, uncertain of her place. Mrs. Hawthorne! A plump woman in an elaborate hat descended on them. And who is this? Miss Charlotte Whitmore from Boston. She's helping with the household and the children's education, Mrs. Hawthorne's tone carried a warning Charlotte couldn't quite interpret. Miss Whitmore, this is Mrs. Pruitt. She runs the general store. Boston! Mrs. Pruitt's eyes lit with gossip hunger. How exotic. What brings you all the way out here, dear? Fresh air, Charlotte said smoothly, the lie coming easier now. My father thought the climate would be beneficial. Mrs. Pruitt looked unconvinced, but smiled anyway. Well, you must come by the store sometime. We get catalogs from back east. You could advise me on what's fashionable. They were saved by the church bell. Charlotte followed the Hawthorns inside, grateful to escape Mrs. Pruitt's questions. The church was simple: wooden pews, plain windows, a pulpit worn smooth by hands. It smelled of old wood and candle wax. Charlotte sat through the service trying not to think about the last time she'd been in church, her mother's funeral 10 years ago. After that, her father had declared religion a woman's concern and stopped attending. Charlotte had gone occasionally, more for social reasons than faith. The rituals had always felt empty to her, words repeated without meaning. This service was different somehow. The preacher's sermon was about perseverance, about making something from nothing, about strength through hardship. People around her nodded and murmured agreement. These weren't people performing piety for social credit. They actually believed. Charlotte envied them that certainty. After the service, the congregation spilled into the sunshine for socializing. Charlotte stood awkwardly beside the wagon while Mrs. Hawthorn chatted with neighbors. Several women glanced her way, whispering behind gloved hands. Charlotte felt the familiar weight of being discussed, evaluated, found wanting. Miss Whitmore? She turned to find Rhett approaching, cleaned up for Sunday in a shirt that wasn't covered in dust. He looked different somehow. Younger, maybe, or just less guarded. Mr. Calder, I didn't know you attended church. Don't usually, but Mrs. Hawthorn asked me to drive some supplies back from town, so here I am. He glanced at the whispering women. Making friends? Not exactly. They're just curious. New woman shows up, especially one from back east. People want to know the story. There's no story. Everyone's got a story. Rhett leaned against the wagon. But I suppose you don't owe anyone yours. Charlotte studied him. Why are you always kind to me? The question seemed to surprise him. I'm not particularly kind. You bandaged my hands. You taught me about tomatoes. You talked to me like I'm a person instead of a problem. She crossed her arms. The other men barely acknowledge I exist. The other men are smart enough to keep their distance from a woman they can't have. Rhett's expression was unreadable. I figure there's no harm in basic decency. Is that what this is? Basic decency? What else would it be? Charlotte didn't have an answer for that. Before she could formulate one, Mrs. Hawthorn called that it was time to leave. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, everyone tired from the social performance. Charlotte watched the landscape roll past and tried not to think about Rhett's words. The following week brought the first real test of Charlotte's resolve. Mrs. Hawthorn announced at breakfast that it was slaughtering time. They'd be processing chickens all day to stock the winter stores. Ever killed anything before? Mrs. Hawthorn asked Charlotte. No. Well, you're about to learn. The process was exactly as brutal as Charlotte had feared. Mrs. Hawthorn demonstrated with swift efficiency, grab the chicken, lay its head on the stump, bring down the hatchet in one clean stroke. The body would flap and spasm for a few seconds before going still. Now you try. Charlotte's hands shook as she grabbed a chicken from the coop. The bird squawked and struggled, surprisingly strong. She managed to get its head positioned on the stump, but couldn't make herself swing the hatchet. It's just a chicken, Mrs. Hawthorn said, not unkindly. Out here, if you eat meat, you need to be willing to do this. It's honest work. Charlotte thought about all the elaborate meals she'd eaten in Boston, never once considering where the meat came from or who'd done the killing. The hypocrisy of her squeamishness hit her hard. She swung the hatchet. The first time was awful. She didn't get a clean cut and the chicken thrashed, and she had to swing twice more before it died. She stood there breathing hard, covered in blood and feathers, fighting the urge to vomit. Better, Mrs. Hawthorn said. Next one will be cleaner. They processed 20 chickens that day. By the end, Charlotte could do it without flinching, her movements efficient if not quite as smooth as Mrs. Hawthorn's. She plucked and gutted and cleaned, her hands deep in viscera, her dress soaked with blood. That night she scrubbed herself raw in the washroom, trying to get the smell of death out from under her fingernails. But when she looked in the mirror, she saw someone different, someone capable of hard things, someone who didn't break. The transformation wasn't gentle or beautiful. It was blood and calluses and exhaustion. But it was real. Charlotte dried her hands and went to help with supper, where the chicken she'd killed that morning was now roasting in the oven, smelling of rosemary and salt and survival. 2 weeks into her time at the ranch, Charlotte woke to shouting. She stumbled from bed, heart racing, and found Mrs. Hawthorne already in the kitchen, face grim. "What's happening?" One of the hands spotted smoke on the north ridge. Could be a wildfire. Mrs. Hawthorne was packing supplies with quick efficiency, bandages, water, food. "If it is, we'll need everyone who can carry a bucket." Through the window, Charlotte could see men rushing toward the barn, saddling horses. The sky to the north was stained with something darker than dawn. "What can I do?" Charlotte asked. "Stay with the children. Keep them calm. If I send word, pack essentials and be ready to evacuate." Mrs. Hawthorne paused, her expression softening slightly. "You've done well here, Miss Whitmore. Better than I expected. But fire doesn't care about how hard you've worked or how much you've learned. If I say run, you run." She left before Charlotte could respond. Through the window, Charlotte watched riders pour out of the ranch yard toward the smoke. Rhett among them, his face set and determined. The hours that followed were the longest of Charlotte's life. She kept Samuel and Emma occupied with games and stories, but she couldn't stop watching the northern sky where the smoke grew thicker, darker. Around midday, one of the younger hands, a boy named Jake, who usually worked in the barn, came racing back. "Mrs. Hawthorne needs help," he shouted. "Fire jumped the creek. They're trying to hold it at the fence line, but they need everyone." Charlotte looked at Samuel and Emma, their frightened faces, then at Jake. "Take the children to the Morrisons," she said. "I'm going to help." "Ma'am, that's not—" "The Morrisons are 2 miles south, away from the fire. The children will be safe there." Charlotte was already grabbing canteens, soaking cloths in water. "Tell Mrs. Morrison what's happening, then get back to the fire." Jake hesitated, then nodded and herded the protesting children toward the wagon. Charlotte watched them go, making sure they were headed the right direction, then turned north. She ran. The smoke hit her first, thick and choking, making her eyes stream. She wrapped a wet cloth around her face and kept going, following the sound of voices and the orange glow visible even through the haze. The heat built as she got closer, the air itself seeming to burn. She crested a ridge and saw them. A line of men and women stretched across the grassland, beating at flames with wet blankets, digging fire breaks with shovels, hauling buckets from a nearby stream. The fire roared like a living thing, consuming everything in its path. Charlotte didn't let herself think. She grabbed a bucket, filled it from the stream, and ran it to the line. The water hissed and steamed, barely making a dent. She ran back for another, then another, her lungs screaming for clean air that didn't exist. "What the hell are you doing here?" Rhett appeared beside her, face black with soot, eyes wild. "You should be with the children. They're safe. I can help. You could die. So could you." A tree exploded nearby, showering them with sparks. Rhett grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the stream. "Stay in the waterline. Don't go near the flames. If I yell at you to run, you run. Understand?" Charlotte nodded, already filling another bucket. They worked for hours. The world narrowed to bucket and fire and breath. Charlotte's arms shook with exhaustion. Blisters formed and popped on her palms. The heat seared her exposed skin. But she kept moving, kept hauling water, kept fighting alongside people who'd gone from strangers to allies in the span of heartbeats. Somewhere in the chaos, a section of fence collapsed, sending a wall of flame toward the main barn. The horses inside screamed in terror. "We have to get them out," someone shouted. Rhett was already running toward the barn, disappearing into smoke so thick Charlotte couldn't see more than shadows. She heard him calling to the horses, heard hooves pounding, heard the structure groan as fire ate through support beams. Then nothing. Charlotte dropped her bucket and ran toward the barn, ignoring the shouts behind her. The heat was incredible, stealing the breath from her lungs. She couldn't see, could barely think, knew only that Rhett was in there and might be dying. "Rhett!" she screamed. "Rhett!" A figure stumbled from the smoke, Rhett leading 3 panicked horses, his shirt smoking. He shoved the lead ropes at Charlotte. "Get them clear," he coughed. "More inside. Don't go back in there!" But he was already gone, swallowed by flames and smoke. The barn groaned again, louder this time. Charlotte could hear wood splintering, could see the roof starting to sag. She tied the horses to a post far from the fire and turned back. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to save herself. Instead, she grabbed a wet blanket and ran toward the barn. The heat drove her back once, twice. On the third attempt, she made it to the door, covering her mouth with the blanket, squinting through smoke that burned like acid. She could hear Rhett somewhere in the darkness, calling to the horses in a voice gone hoarse. "Rhett, the roof's going!" A crash behind her as part of the structure collapsed. Charlotte felt the shock through her feet, felt debris rain down. Then Rhett was there, leading 2 more horses, blood streaming down his temple. "Out!" he gasped. "Now!" They ran as the barn came down behind them, the sound like the end of the world. Charlotte felt the blast of heat, felt something strike her shoulder. Then they were clear and falling together into the grass, gasping for air that tasted like ash and survival. Around them, the tide of the fire had turned. The wind had shifted, pushing the flames back on themselves, and the line of defenders was gaining ground. Charlotte lay on her back, watching embers spiral into the sky like dying stars, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and something else. Relief. Terror. The wild joy of being alive. "You're crazy," Rhett said beside her, his voice wrecked. "Coming after me like that? Could have died." "So could you." "I'm paid to risk dying. You're not." Charlotte turned her head to look at him. His face was black with soot, cut and bleeding, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional handsomeness and everything to do with being real, alive, present. "Maybe I wanted to," she said. "Risk it, I mean. Maybe I'm tired of being safe." Rhett stared at her for a long moment. Then he started laughing, a rough, broken sound that might have been a sob. "You're definitely crazy." The fire burned itself out by nightfall, leaving a blackened scar across the northern pasture, but sparing the buildings and most of the herd. They'd lost fencing, some equipment, the barn, but no lives. That counted as a victory. Charlotte helped tend burns and cuts in the yard while Mrs. Hawthorne orchestrated the cleanup. Her hands moved automatically, wrapping bandages, offering water, providing what comfort she could. When she finally made it back to the house, it was well past midnight. Samuel and Emma were asleep in the main room, returned from the Morrisons safely. Mrs. Hawthorne sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, looking older than Charlotte had ever seen her. "You did good today," the older woman said quietly. "Damned foolish, going after Rhett like that. But good." Charlotte sank into a chair, too tired to stand. "I couldn't just let him—" "I know." Mrs. Hawthorne's expression was knowing, a little sad. "I know." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the house settle, to the sound of exhausted men bedding down in the bunkhouse. Outside, the smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air, a reminder of what they'd almost lost. "Get some rest," Mrs. Hawthorne finally said. "Tomorrow we start rebuilding." Charlotte stumbled to her room and collapsed onto the bed without undressing. Her body was a map of bruises and burns and exhaustion. But as she drifted towards sleep, she felt something new settling into her bones. She belonged here now, not because she'd been sent here, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she'd fought for this place, bled for it, risked her life alongside people who were becoming something more than strangers. She'd found something worth staying for, and it looked nothing like the life she'd left behind. The morning after the fire, Charlotte woke to find her shoulder had turned purple where debris had struck her. Every breath pulled at muscles she didn't know she had. She dressed slowly, wincing, and emerged to find the ranch already moving despite the exhaustion that should have flattened everyone. The men were out at first light, assessing damage and beginning repairs. Mrs. Hawthorne had breakfast ready as always, though her movements were stiffer than usual. Even Samuel and Emma were subdued, picking at their food with worried eyes. "Is the ranch going to be okay?" Samuel asked his mother. "We'll make it okay," Mrs. Hawthorne said firmly. "That's what we do." Charlotte served the men their breakfast in silence. The dining hall felt different now, the easy camaraderie of people who'd fought together, survived together. When she set down platters of eggs and biscuits, several men nodded their thanks. One, the older hand named Pete, actually said, "Much obliged, miss." She was no longer invisible furniture. She was part of this. After breakfast, Mrs. Hawthorne surveyed the kitchen with hands on her hips. We've got injured men to feed, workers to keep strong, and I need to inventory what we lost. Miss Whitmore, you'll handle the cooking today." Charlotte's stomach dropped. "All of it? You've been watching me for weeks. Time to see if you learned anything." Mrs. Hawthorne was already pulling on her work gloves. "Lunch is at noon sharp. Men need beef stew, biscuits, and something sweet if you can manage it. Don't burn the house down." She left before Charlotte could protest. Charlotte stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the massive stove and the raw ingredients and the weight of expectation. In Boston, she'd never cooked a complete meal by herself. Here, 15 people were counting on her not to fail. She took a breath and started working. The beef was easy enough. Brown it, add vegetables, cover with water, and let it simmer. She'd watched Mrs. Hawthorne do it 100 times. The biscuits were trickier. Her first batch came out lopsided and pale. She tried again, adjusting the oven temperature, working the dough less. Better. For the sweet, she found apples in the root cellar and sugar in the pantry and attempted something like a cobbler, more hope than skill. It went into the oven looking dubious but smelling promising. At noon, the men filed in, and Charlotte served them stew that was maybe too salty, and biscuits that were merely acceptable, and cobbler that was burned on the edges but sweet in the middle. She waited for complaints, for someone to ask where Mrs. Hawthorne was. Instead, they ate. Some went back for seconds. Tommy told her the cobbler was good, even the burned parts. Charlotte cleared the plates, feeling something dangerously close to pride. That afternoon, while the men worked on rebuilding the barn's frame, Charlotte tackled the laundry. The fire had left everything reeking of smoke. She hauled water, boiled it, scrubbed shirts and trousers and bedding until her knuckles bled. The clothesline stretched across the yard, and she pinned up wet fabric under a sun that had gone back to being merciless. "Need help with that?" She turned to find Rhett approaching, his shirt off and his torso wrapped in bandages. The cut on his temple had been stitched. Someone had done rough but effective work. He looked exhausted, bruised, alive. "Shouldn't you be resting?" Charlotte asked. "Can't rest. Too much to rebuild." He reached for a wet sheet. "Besides, I came to thank you." "For what?" "For being stupid enough to run into a burning barn after me." His mouth quirked. "That was the bravest damn fool thing I've ever seen." Charlotte pinned up a pair of trousers. "You would have done the same." "Maybe, but I'm paid to be a damn fool. You're not." He handed her another sheet, their fingers brushing. "Why'd you really do it?" "I already told you." "No, I mean really. You could have stayed safe. Let me handle it. That would have been the smart choice." Charlotte looked at him, this man who'd been distant and measuring when they first met, who'd slowly become something she couldn't quite name. "Because leaving you to die alone felt worse than dying myself." The words hung between them, too honest, too raw. Rhett's expression shifted. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. He opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. "Well," he said finally, "try not to make a habit of it. Try not to run into any more burning buildings." "Can't promise that." "Neither can I." They finished hanging the laundry in comfortable silence. When the last sheet was pinned, Rhett lingered like there was something else he wanted to say. Charlotte waited, her heart doing strange things in her chest. "Charlotte," he started, then stopped. "Miss Whitmore, I should get back to work." He walked away before she could tell him that she didn't mind him using her first name, that in fact she wanted him to. Charlotte watched him go, then forced herself back to the house where 100 other tasks waited. But something had shifted between them, and they both knew it. The next week passed in a blur of reconstruction. The men worked dawn to dusk raising the new barn, and Charlotte worked just as hard keeping everyone fed and the household running. Mrs. Hawthorne seemed to be testing her, piling on more responsibilities, managing the preserves, overseeing the henhouse, even helping with the ranch's basic bookkeeping. "You're educated enough to track numbers," Mrs. Hawthorne said, spreading ledgers across the kitchen table. "Income here, expenses here, cattle counts here. Keep it neat." Charlotte bent over the books, her mind engaging with the mathematical puzzles in a way it hadn't since her tutors had given up trying to teach her deportment. She found discrepancies, corrected errors, reorganized the system to make it clearer. "Well," Mrs. Hawthorne said when she reviewed Charlotte's work, "maybe that finishing school wasn't completely useless after all." The children's lessons continued, though Charlotte found herself teaching them things her tutors never had. practical mathematics about cattle prices and land measurement, reading from newspapers about territorial politics, writing through stories about the world they lived in rather than the world of Boston drawing rooms. "Miss Whitmore," Emma said one afternoon, looking up from her slate, "were you sad to leave Boston?" Charlotte considered the question. A month ago she would have said yes without hesitation. Now she wasn't sure. "I was sad to leave the life I thought I'd have," she said carefully. "But that life wasn't real. It was just pretty and comfortable." "And this life?" Samuel asked. "This life is real." Charlotte looked at their faces, so different from the bored society children she might have taught in Boston. "It's harder, but it's honest." "I think I like honest better," Emma said. "So do I, sweetheart. So do I." Sunday brought another trip to town, and this time Charlotte noticed the change in how people looked at her. Mrs. Pruitt still asked intrusive questions, but several women approached to thank her for helping during the fire. A rancher's wife invited her to a quilting circle. The blacksmith's daughter, maybe 15, stared at Charlotte with something like admiration. "You really ran into a burning barn?" the girl asked. "I really did. That's the bravest thing I ever heard." Charlotte didn't feel brave. She felt lucky to be alive and confused about what she was becoming. But she smiled at the girl anyway, remembering what it was like to be young and desperate for someone to admire. On the ride back to the ranch, Mrs. Hawthorne said, "You're becoming known, Miss Whitmore. That can be good or dangerous, depending." "Known for what?" "For not being what they expected. For not breaking." Mrs. Hawthorne adjusted the reins. "People out here respect strength. You've shown it, but that also means they'll expect more from you." Charlotte looked out at the landscape rolling past, the mountains sharp against the sky. "I can handle more." "I believe you can. Question is whether you want to." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Hawthorne was quiet for a moment. "You came here because you had to, not because you wanted to. But you could leave now if you chose. You've earned enough trust that someone would take you on. The Morrisons need a governess. The Pruitts mentioned needing help at the store. You've got options." Charlotte hadn't realized that was true. She'd been so focused on surviving day to day that she hadn't considered the future beyond the next meal, the next task. "Are you asking me to leave, Jas?" she asked carefully. "I'm asking if you want to stay, because if you do, we need to make it official. Proper contract, better pay. Can't keep working you like a field hand and paying you pocket change if you're going to be permanent." "Permanent," Charlotte repeated. The word felt strange and solid and terrifying. "Think about it," Mrs. Hawthorne said. "No rush, but I'd like an answer before winter comes." That night, Charlotte lay in bed staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine her future. Boston was closed to her. Her father had made that clear, and even if he hadn't, she knew she couldn't go back to being the girl she'd been. But staying here meant accepting this life, this place, these people as her own. It meant accepting that Charlotte Whitmore of Beacon Hill was gone, replaced by whoever this new woman was becoming. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt almost like relief. The new barn went up faster than Charlotte expected, the frame rising in strong lines against the sky. She watched the men work when she had spare moments, marveling at their efficiency. Rhett moved among them with easy authority, directing placement and checking joints, his shirt sticking to his back with sweat. Charlotte forced herself to look away and focus on her own work. But it was getting harder to ignore what was building between them. The way her heart jumped when she saw him. The way he found excuses to talk to her, asking about the children's progress, commenting on the weather. Once bringing her wildflowers he claimed he'd found by accident. "Thought they might brighten up your room," he'd said, looking uncomfortable. Charlotte had put them in a jar by her window and watched them slowly die, unable to make cut flowers last but unwilling to throw them away. One evening, after supper, she was hauling scraps to the compost when she found Rhett sitting on the porch rail, staring at the sunset. He looked tired, older somehow, like the weight of rebuilding was pressing on him. "You all right?" she asked. He glanced at her. "Just thinking." "About?" "About how close we came to losing everything, how lucky we were." He rubbed his face. "I've been through fires before, lost friends to them. This time everyone made it, and I keep waiting for the relief to hit, but it hasn't yet." Charlotte set down her bucket and leaned against the porch post. "Maybe relief takes longer than we think." "Maybe." He was quiet for a moment. Can I ask you something? Of course. What are you running from? Charlotte's throat tightened. What makes you think I'm running? Because nobody comes to the middle of nowhere unless they're running from something or looking for something. And you don't seem like you're looking. She could lie, make up some story about health or adventure. But she was tired of lying, tired of carrying the weight of secrets. A man attacked me, she said quietly, at a ball in Boston. I fought him off, and everyone saw me disheveled and upset. But they believed him when he said I was the one who'd encouraged him, that I was unstable. The words came easier than she expected. My father believed him too, or he pretended to. Either way, he sent me here to disappear. Rhett's jaw tightened. That's why you flinched when I grabbed your wrist. That first day at the creek. You noticed that? I notice everything about you. He said it matter-of-factly, like it was obvious. This man, he face any consequences? No. Men like him never do. And your father just let it happen? He arranged it. Charlotte laughed bitterly. He chose his reputation over his daughter. I don't even know if he believed Bradford or just didn't care. Bradford, Rhett repeated. That his name? Cornelius Bradford. Why? No reason. Just like to know who deserves a bullet if he ever shows his face out here. He said it casually, but Charlotte heard the steel underneath. You didn't deserve any of that. You know that, right? I know that now. Didn't then. And now you're here, working yourself to death, proving something to people who don't deserve proof. I'm not proving anything, Charlotte protested. I'm just surviving. You're doing a hell of a lot more than surviving. Rhett turned to face her fully. You're thriving. You've earned respect from people who don't give it easy. You've made yourself indispensable. That's not just survival, Charlotte. The way he said her name made her chest ache. What if I don't know how to be anything else? She whispered. What if I'm only good at enduring? Then you learn. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell leather and smoke and sun on his skin. You learn to cook. You learn to slaughter chickens. You learn to run into burning buildings like an idiot. You can learn to want something for yourself instead of just surviving what life hands you. What if I don't know what I want? I think you do. His hand came up, hesitated, then tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I think you're just scared to admit it. Charlotte's breath caught. They were standing too close, the air between them charged with something dangerous and inevitable. She should step back, maintain propriety, remember all the rules about unmarried women and improper attention. Instead, she asked, What do you want? Right now? Rhett's voice had gone rough. I want to kiss you, but I won't unless you tell me to. Charlotte's heart hammered against her ribs. Every lesson she'd ever learned about proper behavior screamed at her to refuse, to walk away. But those lessons had come from a world that had betrayed her, from people who'd abandoned her the moment she stopped being convenient. Then kiss me, she said. He did. It was nothing like the brutal assault in Bradford's library. Rhett's hand cupped her face gently, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. His lips were soft and questioning against hers, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, when instead she grabbed his shirt and pulled him closer, he made a sound low in his throat and deepened the kiss. Charlotte had been kissed before. Careful pecks from approved suitors, Bradford's violation. This was different. This was want meeting want, rough edges and honesty and the taste of possibility. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Rhett rested his forehead against hers. I've been wanting to do that for weeks, he admitted. Why didn't you? Because you needed time to figure out who you are without men making demands. Because I didn't want to be another person taking from you. He pulled back enough to meet her eyes. But if you want this, want me. I'm here. I don't know what I want, Charlotte said honestly. I'm still figuring out who I am. That's fair. We can figure it out together. The back door opened and they sprang apart like guilty teenagers. Mrs. Hawthorne emerged, took one look at them, and sighed. I hope you two are being smart about this. Mrs. Hawthorne, Rhett started, I'm not blind and I'm not stupid. I've seen how you look at each other. She crossed her arms. I don't care what you do in your private time as long as it doesn't interfere with work and doesn't cause scandal. But Miss Whitmore, you need to understand what this means. Territory like this, People talk. A woman's reputation matters. My reputation was already destroyed, Charlotte said. That's why I'm here. Then don't make it worse. Whatever this is, she gestured between them. Keep it quiet until you know what you're doing, both of you. She went back inside. Charlotte and Rhett looked at each other, the moment broken but not ruined. She's right, Rhett said. We should be careful. I'm tired of being careful. Charlotte, but I'll try. For now. She touched his face, letting herself have that small intimacy. Thank you for telling me to want something. Anytime. They stood together in the gathering darkness, neither quite ready to go inside, both aware that something fundamental had shifted. Tomorrow they'd be careful, discreet. Tonight they allowed themselves this moment of honest wanting. Eventually, the cold drove them apart. Charlotte went to her room and lay awake for hours, her lips still tingling, her heart full of something that felt dangerously like hope. The days that followed were a careful dance of proximity and distance. Charlotte and Rhett worked to keep their attraction hidden, but it colored everything, the way he steadied her when she stumbled carrying a heavy pot, the way she always saved him the best biscuit at breakfast, the accidental touches that lingered half a second too long. The other hands noticed something, though they couldn't quite name it. Tommy started giving Rhett knowing looks. Pete made a comment about young love that made Charlotte blush furiously. Mrs. Hawthorne watched it all with the expression of someone waiting for inevitable disaster. But disaster didn't come. Instead, something quieter happened. Charlotte found herself settling into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like living. She woke before dawn, not with dread, but with purpose. The work was still brutal, but her body had adapted, grown strong. She could haul water without gasping, cook for 15 without panic, manage the children's lessons while also supervising the henhouse. She was becoming competent. More than that, she was becoming necessary. One afternoon, while she was working in the garden, Samuel appeared with dirt on his face and tears in his eyes. What happened? Charlotte asked. Tommy said my arithmetic was wrong and I told him he was stupid and he said I was just like my father, too stubborn to admit when I'm wrong. Samuel's voice broke. Am I like that? Charlotte set down her trowel and pulled him close. Come here. They sat together in the dirt while Samuel cried against her shoulder. Charlotte stroked his hair and let him get it out. This boy who tried so hard to be tough in a world that demanded toughness. You're not your father, she said when he'd quieted. You're yourself. And being stubborn isn't always bad. Sometimes it means you've got conviction, but you have to be willing to learn too. Can you do that? Samuel nodded against her shoulder. I guess. And Samuel, it's okay to cry sometimes. Doesn't make you weak. Rhett never cries. I bet he does. Just not where people can see. She pulled back to look at him. Being strong doesn't mean not feeling things. It means feeling them and keeping going anyway. He seemed to consider this. Is that what you do? Every day. Samuel hugged her tight, then pulled away and wiped his eyes. Thanks, Miss Whitmore. He ran off toward the barn. Charlotte sat in the garden feeling the weight of being trusted, being needed by these children who were starting to feel like her own. That evening, Mrs. Hawthorne found her preparing supper. Samuel told me about your talk. I hope I didn't overstep. You didn't. He needed someone to tell him that. Mrs. Hawthorne began slicing bread. His father loves him, but doesn't know how to show it. And I'm too close to be objective. You're good with them, Miss Whitmore. Better than any governess we've had. Thank you. I'm going to ask you again. Are you staying? Because if you are, I need to know. The children need to know. We can't keep building on uncertain ground. Charlotte set down the spoon she'd been using to stir stew. I'm staying, if you'll have me. Mrs. Hawthorne's expression softened. Then we'll draw up proper papers. $3 a month, room and board. 1 day off weekly. Fair? More than fair. Good. Because I'm getting too old for this work and I need someone I can trust. Mrs. Hawthorne paused. And Charlotte, be careful with Rhett. He's a good man, but this territory eats up happiness quick. Don't count on anything until you're certain. I won't. But Charlotte was already counting, already imagining futures she had no business imagining. She couldn't help it. For the first time since Bradford's assault, she felt like herself again. Not the broken girl who'd fled Boston or the desperate woman who'd arrived exhausted and afraid. Someone new, forged from fire and hard work and small moments of grace. That night she wrote a letter to her father, not asking for forgiveness or explanation, just stating facts. I am well. I have found work that suits me. Do not expect me to return. She didn't sign it with love, just her name. She posted it the next Sunday in town, and when it left her hand, she felt something release in her chest, the last thread connecting her to Boston, severed. The next morning, she woke to her alarm before dawn and thought not about what she'd lost, but about what she was building. A life, a place, maybe even a future. It was enough. Winter came early that year, bringing snow that transformed the ranch into something from a fairy tale. Charlotte had never experienced a frontier winter. The way cold settled into bones and stayed, the way work became twice as hard when your fingers wouldn't bend properly. But she'd also never known the beauty of it, the mornings when the whole world glittered white and silent. She and Rhett had fallen into a pattern of stolen moments. A touch while passing in the yard. Conversations that stretched long after everyone else had gone to bed, sitting by the kitchen stove while snow piled against the windows. Once, he'd kissed her behind the henhouse, and she'd laughed against his mouth at the absurdity of it. Her, Charlotte Whitmore of Beacon Hill, making out with a cowboy while chickens clucked their disapproval. "What's funny?" Rhett had asked. "Everything. Nothing. I'm just happy." He'd smiled, that rare full smile that transformed his face. "Good. You deserve happy." Christmas brought the whole community together at the ranch. Families traveling from neighboring homesteads for a celebration that lasted 2 days. Charlotte cooked until her arms ached, helped Mrs. Hawthorne prepare enough food to feed 50 people, decorated the main room with pine boughs that filled the house with their sharp green scent. Emma was beside herself with excitement, dragging Charlotte around to meet every child, every family. Samuel tried to act too old for such festivities, but Charlotte caught him sneaking extra cookies when he thought no one was looking. On Christmas Eve, after the children had finally been wrestled into bed and the last guests had departed for the night, Charlotte found herself alone with Rhett on the porch. The sky was clear and frozen, stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. "I got you something," Rhett said, pulling a small package from his coat. Charlotte unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a pair of leather work gloves, supple and well-made, sized perfectly for her hands. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "They're practical. Your hands are always torn up from work." He looked embarrassed. "I know it's not fancy like what you're probably used to. They're perfect." Charlotte pulled them on, flexing her fingers. They fit like they'd been made for her. "Thank you." "You're welcome." He paused. "I wasn't sure if you'd want something more, feminine, but I figured you'd rather have something useful." "You figured right." Charlotte kissed him, quick and sweet. "I have something for you too." She pulled out the scarf she'd been knitting in secret for weeks, the wool dyed deep blue. It wasn't fancy work, her stitches were uneven and there were definitely some dropped loops, but she'd made it herself. Rhett wrapped it around his neck, his expression soft. "You made this." "Don't sound so surprised. I can do more than burn biscuits." "I know you can." He pulled her close, the scarf scratchy against her cheek. "Charlotte, I need to tell you something." Her heart jumped. "What?" "I'm in love with you. Have been for a while now, if I'm being honest. And I know it's fast and maybe too soon, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel it." Charlotte's breath caught. She'd known, of course, had felt it in every look, every touch, every moment they'd stolen. But hearing the words made it real, made it something that demanded response. "I love you too," she said, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. "I didn't think I'd ever trust anyone enough to love them again. But then there you were, bandaging my hands and teaching me about tomatoes and being impossible not to love." Rhett laughed, the sound rough with emotion. "Tomatoes. Real romantic." "It was to me." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and Charlotte let herself fall into it without fear or reservation. This was nothing like Bradford's violation or the careful courtship of Boston suitors. This was honest wanting between equals, built on shared hardship and mutual respect. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Rhett said, "Marry me." Charlotte blinked. "What?" Marry me. I know I don't have much, just my wages and what I've saved. But I'm good with my hands. I can build us a house on the edge of Hawthorne land if they'll lease it. We could have our own place, our own life. He was talking fast now, nervous. I know you came from money and society, and I'm just a ranch hand, but yes, Charlotte interrupted. I promise I'd work hard and what? Yes, I'll marry you. Rhett stared at her like he couldn't quite believe it. Really? Really? Charlotte felt tears sting her eyes, but they were good tears, happy ones. I don't care about money or society. I care about you, about this life we could build together. He swept her up and spun her around, both of them laughing like idiots in the frozen night. When he set her down, he was grinning so wide it must have hurt. We should tell the Hawthorns, Charlotte said. Tomorrow. Tonight is just ours. They stayed on the porch until the cold drove them inside, planning a future that felt impossible and perfect and real. The next morning, they told the Hawthorns over breakfast. Mrs. Hawthorne looked between them with an expression that was equal parts exasperated and pleased. Well, she said finally, took you long enough to make it official. Mr. Hawthorne actually smiled, a rare sight. Congratulations, Rhett. You're getting a good woman. Don't I know it? Samuel cheered. Emma wanted to know if she could be in the wedding. Charlotte assured her she could, already imagining the little girl in a nice dress, scattering wildflowers. We'll need to build you a house, Mr. Hawthorne said to Rhett. Can't have my foreman living in the bunkhouse once he's married. Foreman? Rhett's eyes widened. Been thinking about it for a while. You've earned it. Comes with a small raise and a plot of land you can lease cheap. Mr. Hawthorne cut into his eggs. Figure we'll break ground in spring. Have you settled by summer? That give you enough time to plan a wedding? Charlotte and Rhett looked at each other, both a little stunned by how fast their lives were changing. That's more than enough time, Charlotte managed. Thank you. Both of you. Mrs. Hawthorne waved a hand. Don't thank me yet. You're still working until you're married, and probably after too. I'm not losing my best help just because you're getting a ring. But she was smiling, and Charlotte knew the older woman was genuinely happy for them. The weeks that followed were busy ones. Word of their engagement spread through the community, bringing congratulations and a few raised eyebrows. Charlotte was still an outsider in many ways, still the mysterious Boston woman who'd appeared from nowhere. But the people who mattered were supportive, and that was enough. Charlotte continued her work at the ranch, her hands confident now with tasks that had once terrified her. She could slaughter a chicken without flinching, cook for 20 without breaking a sweat, manage the household accounts with efficiency that impressed even Mr. Hawthorne. She was good at this life, more than good. She was thriving. In late February, a letter arrived that changed everything. Charlotte was in the kitchen when Mrs. Hawthorne brought it to her, the envelope expensive cream paper with a Boston postmark, her father's handwriting. You all right? Mrs. Hawthorne asked, watching Charlotte's face drain of color. I don't know. Charlotte's hand shook as she opened it. The letter was brief, coldly formal. Charlotte, investigation has revealed that Cornelius Bradford assaulted 3 other women before you. One finally came forward with evidence. He has been arrested and charged. Your name has been cleared. You're welcome to return home. Father, not your loving father, not an apology. Just facts and an invitation as cold as the snow outside. Charlotte read it twice, then handed it to Mrs. Hawthorne without speaking. The older woman scanned it quickly, her expression darkening. That son of a... She stopped herself. Your name is cleared. That's good news. Is it? Isn't it? Charlotte looked around the kitchen where she'd learned to cook, to work, to be useful. Through the window, she could see Rhett working with the horses, his movements easy and familiar. Beyond him, the mountains rose sharp against winter sky. I don't know, she admitted. I thought I'd want this, vindication, proof I wasn't lying. But now that I have it, she trailed off. Now that you have it, you realize you don't need it, Mrs. Hawthorne finished gently. You've already proven yourself, just not to them. He wants me to come back. What do you want? Charlotte thought about Boston, the narrow streets and narrower minds, the constant performance of being someone she wasn't. Then she thought about the ranch, about Emma's laughter and Samuel's questions and Rhett's hands gentle on her face. "I want to stay here," she said firmly. "I want to marry Rhett and build our house and teach the children and live this life, but I also want them to know. Everyone in Boston who believed Bradford, who called me a liar, who abandoned me, I want them to know they were wrong." Charlotte's hands clenched. "Is that petty?" "It's human." Mrs. Hawthorne poured them both coffee. "You could write back. Tell them you're not returning, but you accept their apology, if they'd bothered to give you one." "My father didn't apologize. He just stated facts." "Then tell him facts right back. Tell him you've moved on, found a better life. That's the best revenge there is." Charlotte composed the letter that afternoon, each word chosen carefully. "Father, I received your letter. I'm glad the truth has been revealed, though I note you offer no apology for your role in my exile. I will not be returning to Boston. I have made a life here, a good one, built on honest work and genuine affection. I'm engaged to be married to a good man who sees my worth. I have students who rely on me, friends who value me, and a future that excites rather than frightens me. You sent me away to disappear. Instead, I found myself. For that, I suppose I should thank you, though I suspect that wasn't your intention. Tell your society friends that Charlotte Whitmore is doing quite well without them. Charlotte." She posted it the next Sunday and this time felt no grief at severing ties, only relief. Spring arrived gradually, the snow melting into mud before grass began to green. The men broke ground on Charlotte and Rhett's house in March. A simple structure, but well made. Charlotte spent her free time planning the interior, where the bed would go, how she'd arrange the kitchen, what curtains she'd sew for the windows. "You're nesting," Mrs. Hawthorne observed one afternoon. "Is that bad?" "It's natural. Just don't forget you've still got work here until the wedding." The wedding was planned for June, when the weather would be reliable and the wildflowers in bloom. Charlotte and Rhett would marry in the small church in town, followed by a celebration at the ranch. It wouldn't be fancy. Charlotte was sewing her own dress, simple white cotton with blue ribbons, but it would be theirs. In April, another letter arrived from Boston. This one was from Margaret Ashford, Charlotte's childhood friend. "Dearest Charlotte, I heard about Bradford's arrest and your vindication. I need you to know how deeply sorry I am for believing him, for abandoning you when you needed support. I was a coward, and you deserved better. Your father told the ladies' auxiliary that you're living in New Mexico territory and engaged to be married. Some of the ladies were scandalized. Imagine choosing a frontier life over Boston society. But I think it sounds wonderful. You always did have more courage than the rest of us. I hope you're happy. I hope you've found peace, and I hope someday you might forgive me for failing you when it mattered most." With love and regret, Margaret Charlotte read the letter 3 times, feeling complicated emotions twist through her chest. Anger that Margaret had believed Bradford, sadness for the friendship they'd lost, but also understanding. She'd been part of that world once, knew how hard it was to stand against the tide. She wrote back that night, "Dear Margaret, thank you for your letter. I appreciate the apology, though I admit the wounds are still fresh. Perhaps with time they'll heal. You're right that I'm happy here. Happier than I ever was in Boston, though I didn't know it was possible to be happy while working this hard. I've learned to cook, to teach, to survive things I never imagined I'd face. I've fallen in love with a man who values me for who I am, not what I represent. This life isn't easy or glamorous, but it's honest. And honesty, I've learned, is worth more than all the elegance Boston could offer. I forgive you, Margaret. We were all trapped in that world, doing what we thought we had to do. I hope you find your own way out of the cage. Sincerely, Charlotte." She sealed the letter and set it aside for posting, feeling another piece of her old life settle into place. May brought warm weather and the final preparations for the wedding. The house was nearly complete, Rhett working late into the evenings to finish details. Charlotte sewed her dress by lamplight, Emma helping by threading needles and chattering about how pretty everything would be. "Are you nervous?" Emma asked one night. "A little," Charlotte admitted. "Getting married is a big step. But you love Rhett." "I do." "Then why be nervous?" "Out of the mouths of children." Charlotte smiled and pulled Emma close. "You're right, I shouldn't be. But there was one last ghost to face. 3 weeks before the wedding, a stranger arrived at the ranch. Well-dressed, clearly from back east, asking for Miss Charlotte Whitmore. Charlotte met him in the yard, Mrs. Hawthorne hovering protectively nearby. "Miss Whitmore, my name is James Fletcher. I'm an attorney representing the Bradford family." Charlotte's blood went cold. "What do you want?" "The Bradfords are anxious to avoid further scandal. They're prepared to offer you compensation for your difficulties." He pulled out an envelope. $10,000, to be paid immediately upon your signature on a non-disclosure agreement. $10,000. A fortune. Enough to live comfortably for years, to return to Boston in style if she wanted, to have any life she could imagine. "And in exchange," Charlotte asked carefully, "you agree never to speak publicly about Cornelius Bradford or the events at the Vanderbilt ball. You would not testify at his trial. You would essentially disappear." There it was. They wanted to buy her silence, to make her complicit in hiding what Bradford had done. Charlotte thought about the woman who'd boarded a train 6 months ago, terrified and broken, believing her life was over. Then she looked around at the ranch that had become home, at Mrs. Hawthorne standing ready to defend her, at Rhett approaching from the barn with concern in his eyes. "No," she said firmly. Fletcher blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no. I will not sign your agreement. I will not be bought." Charlotte straightened her spine. "I will absolutely testify at Bradford's trial if called, and I will speak about what he did any time I choose to, because silence protects men like him." "Miss Whitmore, perhaps you don't understand the sum I'm offering." "I understand perfectly. You're offering me money to let Bradford escape full consequences, to help his family save face, to be complicit in the system that destroyed me in the first place." Charlotte's voice was steel. "I refuse." Fletcher looked genuinely confused. "But you're living in the middle of nowhere, working as a governess. Surely you'd prefer— I prefer this life to any life built on lies and bought silence." Charlotte gestured toward the house. "I have work to do, Mr. Fletcher. You can show yourself out." She turned and walked away, Rhett falling into step beside her. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "Better than all right." Charlotte felt light, powerful, free. "I just told the Bradfords to go to hell." Rhett laughed. "That's my girl." That evening, Charlotte told the story over supper. The Hawthorns listened with expressions ranging from outrage to pride. $10,000, Mr. Hawthorne said slowly. "That's serious money." "It's blood money," Charlotte countered, "and I don't want it." "Good," Mrs. Hawthorne said firmly. "Some things can't be bought, like integrity." Samuel looked up from his plate. "What's integrity?" "It's doing the right thing even when the wrong thing would be easier," Charlotte said. "It's choosing honesty over comfort." "Like you did," Emma said, her voice full of admiration. Charlotte felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Like I'm trying to do." The wedding day arrived with perfect weather, clear skies, warm sun, a breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers. Charlotte dressed in her simple white gown with help from Mrs. Hawthorne and Emma, her hands steady as she pinned her mother's pearls in her hair. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Hawthorne said, her voice rough. "I look happy," Charlotte corrected. "That's better." The church was packed with neighbors and friends, people who'd watched Charlotte transform from a frightened city girl into someone strong and capable. She walked down the aisle alone, no father to give her away, and felt no sadness about it. She was giving herself away, freely chosen. Rhett waited at the altar in his best clothes, his face soft with love. When Charlotte reached him, he took her hands and whispered, "You sure about this?" "Never been more sure of anything." The ceremony was simple. They spoke vows about partnership and trust, about building a life together through whatever came. When the preacher pronounced them married and Rhett kissed her, the whole church erupted in cheers. The celebration afterward was everything Charlotte could have wanted: music and dancing, food in abundance, joy that felt earned rather than performed. She danced with Rhett, with Mr. Hawthorne, with Samuel, who stood on her feet, with half the men from the ranch. She laughed until her face hurt and ate cake that Emma had helped frost and let herself be completely, unreservedly happy. As the sun set and people began heading home, Charlotte found herself standing with Rhett at the edge of the yard, looking toward their house silhouetted against pink sky. Ready to start our life? He asked. I already did, months ago, when I decided to stay. Charlotte leaned into him. This is just making it official. They walked to their new house hand in hand. It was small and simple, but the furniture was solid and the bed was soft, and the windows framed views of mountains and sky. Charlotte stood in the middle of their main room and felt a contentment she'd never known in all her years in Boston. What are you thinking? Rhett asked. That I'm grateful. For what? For Bradford attacking me. Rhett's expression darkened. Charlotte, no, listen. If the scandal hadn't happened, I'd still be in Boston. I'd probably be married to some man my father chose, living a life that looked perfect, but felt empty. I'd never have known what I was capable of. Never have met you. Never have become myself. She turned to face him fully. What he did was wrong and terrible, but it led me here, and I wouldn't trade here for anything. Rhett pulled her close. You're the strongest person I know. I'm the stubbornest person you know. There's a difference. Both, then. They made love that night in their own house, in their own bed, as husband and wife. It was tender and awkward and perfect, nothing like the violence Charlotte had experienced before. This was partnership, mutual giving and receiving, the physical expression of everything they'd built together. Afterward, lying in Rhett's arms with moonlight streaming through the window, Charlotte felt something settle deep in her soul. This was home, not just the house or the ranch or even the territory, this feeling of being known and valued and safe. I love you, she whispered. I love you too. Rhett kissed her forehead. Always will. The years that followed were good ones, though not without hardship. There were difficult winters and dry summers, cattle that died and crops that failed. Charlotte lost a pregnancy in the first year of marriage and grieved harder than she'd expected. But there were good times too. The birth of their daughter Grace 2 years later, then their son James a year after that. Watching the children grow alongside Samuel and Emma, all of them running wild across the ranch, building additions onto their house as their family expanded. Charlotte continued teaching, first the Hawthorne children and then others from neighboring ranches who wanted their kids to have education. She became known throughout the territory as the woman who'd run into a burning barn and lived to tell the tale, who'd turned down a fortune to maintain her integrity, who could slaughter a chicken and teach Latin with equal competence. Rhett became one of the most respected ranchers in the territory, known for his fairness and skill. He and Charlotte built their own small herd, modest but profitable, proof of what could be accomplished through partnership. News from Boston came occasionally. Bradford was convicted and sentenced to prison. Charlotte's father died without ever apologizing or acknowledging his mistakes. The society that had once consumed her entire world shrank to irrelevance as her real life expanded. 5 years after the wedding, Charlotte received one final letter from Margaret. Dearest Charlotte, I'm writing to tell you that I've left Boston. After years of watching you build a real life from nothing, I finally found the courage to do the same. I've moved to San Francisco and opened a bookshop. It's small and I work constantly, but it's mine. Thank you for showing me that escape was possible, that there was life beyond the cage. Your friend always, Margaret. Charlotte wrote back immediately, congratulating Margaret and inviting her to visit. Perhaps someday Margaret would make the journey west and meet the Charlotte who existed now. Not the broken girl who'd fled Boston, but the woman who'd been forged by fire and hardship into something stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. On quiet evenings, Charlotte would sometimes stand on her porch and watch the sun set over the mountains, her children playing in the yard, Rhett working with the horses, the whole vast territory spreading out before her. She'd think about the girl she'd been, pampered, naive, desperate for approval. That girl was gone. In her place was someone real, someone earned through struggle and choice, and refusing to break when breaking would have been easier. The frontier had not been kind to her. It had been brutal and unforgiving and harder than anything she'd ever imagined. But it had also given her everything that mattered: purpose, love, the knowledge of her own strength. Charlotte Whitmore had been sent west as punishment, expected to disappear into obscurity and shame. Instead, she disappeared into herself, found the woman she was meant to be all along, and built a life so full and rich that her old existence seemed like someone else's dream. On winter nights, she'd tell her children stories about Boston, not to make them long for that world, but to help them understand how far their mother had come, how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the doorway to your best life. "Were you scared?" Grace asked once. "Terrified," Charlotte admitted. "Every single day at first. But you did it anyway." "I did it anyway." Charlotte pulled her daughter close. "And that's the secret, sweetheart. Courage isn't not being afraid. It's being afraid and choosing to move forward anyway." Grace nestled against her mother's side, content and safe. Growing up in a world where women could be strong and afraid and capable all at once. Where a mother could teach her daughter that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what actually matters. Charlotte looked out at the land she and Rhett had built their life on, the mountains standing eternal against the sky, and felt nothing but gratitude. Not for Bradford or her father or the scandal that had destroyed her reputation, but for the strength she'd discovered in surviving it, for the life she'd claimed when she stopped waiting to be rescued and decided to save herself. The exile that was meant to break her had instead set her free, and Charlotte Whitmore, now Charlotte Calder, had never looked back.